narrated by Therese Plummer and directed by Aaron Moon. And now, the first story in this collection, Meet Kit, an American girl. Kit Kittredge and her family get news that turns their household upside down.
Chapter 1. Good news. Click, clack, clackety. Kit Kittredge smiled as she typed. She loved the sound the typewriter keys made as they struck the paper and the ping of the bell when she got to the end of a line. She loved the inky smell of the typewriter ribbon and the way the black letters looked as they marched across the page, telling a story the way she wanted it told. It was a hot afternoon in August. Kit and her best friend Ruthie were in Kit's room writing a newspaper for Kit's dad. Kit was not a very good typist. She used only her 2 pointer fingers, and she made a lot of mistakes, which she had to XXXXX out. But Dad never minded. Every night when he came home from work, he gave Kit the real newspaper so that she could read the headlines and the baseball scores and the funnies. He was always very pleased when Kit gave him one of her newspapers in return. Kit finished the paragraph she was typing. "Read me what we have so far," said Ruthie. Kit cleared her throat and read. "Ruthie Smithens and Kit Kittredge are reading lots of books this summer. Ruthie has read the blue, yellow, and red fairy books by Andrew Lang. She is now reading the Lilac Fairy book. I am interested in princes and princesses, so I like fairy tales," said Ruthie. "Kit Kittredge is reading The Adventures of Robin Hood and His Merry Men. I like the way Robin Hood tricks the bad guy, the sheriff of Nottingham," said Kit, "and the way he robs rich people and gives their money to poor people. I think it would be great to live in Sherwood Forest." "That's good," said Ruthie when Kit finished reading. "I like it." "Me too," said Kit. "What should we write about now?" "Write about Charlie and the cookies," said Ruthie. Charlie was Kit's brother, who was 16. Kit thought a moment. Then she typed. "Congratulations to Charlie Kittredge. He set a world's record today. He ate a whole plate of ginger snaps that were supposed to be for Mother's Garden Club. Charlie is going to college in a few weeks. He should try out for the eating team." Ruthie looked over Kit's shoulder and giggled as she read what Kit had written. "Now what?" she asked. Kit picked up a pencil and put it behind her ear so that she'd look like a newspaper reporter. "Well," she said, "we could write about how hot it is." Ruthie nodded, quickly at first, then slower and slower. Finally, she let her chin fall to her chest, closed her eyes, and pretended to snore. "You're right," said Kit. "Weather's boring. There aren't any people in it. This is supposed to be a newspaper, not a snooze paper. You could write about how your mother redecorated your room," Ruthie said. I think it's as pretty as a princess's room. Don't you? Answered Kit, with a crooked smile. It's okay. It's just a little too pink for me. I'd rather sleep in a treehouse like Robin Hood. Ruthie shook her head. You're crazy, she said. Yup, said Kit cheerfully. She knew Ruthie was right, of course. Her room was pretty. Mother had redecorated it for her earlier that summer as a surprise. And, as with everything Mother did, it was lovely. Kit's room was painted pale pink with white trim. There was a canopy bed as high and white and fluffy as a cloud, and a dressing table with a lacy skirt around it. The desk was white and spindly-legged. It looked too delicate to hold the big black typewriter that crouched on it. Mother had asked Kit to keep the typewriter in the closet, please, and take it out only when she used it. But Kit always forgot to put the typewriter away. Besides, she used it a lot. The typewriter ended up being on the desk all the time, even though it looked out of place in the frilly room. Kit squirmed on the poofy stool that had replaced her old swivel chair. She believed in telling the truth straight out, but so far she hadn't told Mother that she felt as out of place in the frilly room as the typewriter looked. Mother was so pleased with all the lacy pinkness and so sure the room was a girl's dream. Which it probably is, Kit admitted to herself. Just not mine. The redecorating story's no good because Dad knows all about it, she said to Ruthie. It's not new. Kit sighed. I wish something would happen around here. Some dramatic change. Then we'd have a headline that would really grab Dad's attention. Like in the real newspapers, said Ruthie. Exactly, said Kit. I don't know, said Ruthie. When my parents read the headlines these days, they get worried. The news is always about the Depression, and it's always bad. I don't think we want our paper to be like that. No, said Kit. We want good news. She knew there hadn't been much good news in the real newspapers for a long time. The whole country was in a mess because of the Depression. Dad had explained it to her. About 3 years ago, people got nervous about their money and stopped buying as many things as they used to. So some stores had to close down. The people who worked in the stores lost their jobs. Then the factories that made the things the stores used to sell had to close down. So the factory workers lost their jobs too. Pretty soon, the people who'd lost their jobs had no money to pay their doctors, or house painters, or music teachers. So those people got poorer too. Kit was glad that her dad still had his job at his car dealership. She and Ruthie knew kids at school whose fathers had lost their jobs. They'd seen those fathers selling apples on street corners, trying to earn a few cents a day. Some kids had disappeared from school because their families didn't have enough money to pay the rent anymore, and they had to move. Dad said the Depression was like a terrible, slippery hole. Once you fell in, it was almost impossible to get out. Kit knew the Depression was getting worse all the time because the newspaper headlines said so almost every night. But inside Kit's house, no dramatic changes worth a headline seemed to be happening. The girls were about to give up on finding any news, good or bad, when Charlie popped his head in the door. "Hey, girls," he said. "Mother's garden club's here. You better get downstairs quick if you want anything to eat. I saw Mrs. Culver already diving head first into the nut dish." "Thanks for telling us, Charlie," said Kit. "Oh, boy," said Ruthie. "Maybe there'll be some cake for us." "Maybe there'll be some news for us," said Kit. She grabbed her notepad and took the pencil from behind her ear. "Come on." Kit and Ruthie thundered down the stairs. They slowed their steps in the hallway so that they wouldn't sound, as Mother always said, like a herd of stampeding elephants. Mother liked things to be just so when the garden club ladies came. She brought out all her best crystal, china, silver, and linen, and arranged her most beautiful plants on the terrace where the ladies met. Kit could hear the ladies' voices and the clink of their iced tea glasses out on the terrace now. Above all the other voices, Kit heard Mrs. Wolfe complimenting Mother. "Margaret," Mrs. Wolfe was saying, "your sponge cake is perfection. Mine is just that, a sponge." Mrs. Wolfe hooted at her own joke before she went on. "Please, give me your recipe." "I'd be glad to," said Mother, just as Kit and Ruthie stepped onto the terrace. Mother looked as cool and slender as a mint leaf in her pale green dress. Kit wanted to fling herself at Mother and hug her, but she held herself back. Her fingers had typewriter ink on them. It would never do to leave ink stains on Mother's perfect green dress. Mother smiled when she saw the girls. Then she turned to her guests and said, "Ladies, you remember Ruth Ann Smithens and my daughter Kit, don't you?" "Yes, of course," said the ladies. "Hello, girls." "Hello," said Kit and Ruthie politely. "Do help yourselves to some refreshments, girls," said Mother. "We will," said Kit and Ruthie, smiling broadly. The girls filled their plates and retreated to a corner behind a potted palm to enjoy their feast and observe the ladies. At first, the ladies discussed garden club business, such as how to get rid of bugs, slugs, and other garden pests. It was pretty boring, although the girls did get giggly when Mrs. Wilmore said she was just beside herself because she had spots on her phlox. Then the talk moved on to who was going to weed the flower bed at the hospital, which the garden club ladies took turns doing. "I believe it's my turn," said Mrs. Howard, "but I'm afraid I won't be able to weed this month. In fact," she hesitated and blinked her big round eyes, "I'm afraid I won't be able to be part of the garden club at all anymore." Kit and Ruthie looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. This sounded interesting. Why would Mrs. Howard be quitting the garden club? Kit leaned forward so that she could hear better. There may be a story in this for our newspaper, she thought. All the ladies murmured that they were sorry, and Mother said, "Oh, Louise, that's too bad." "Well," said Mrs. Howard, "I'm moving to Chicago. My husband is already there, and so my son Sterling and I are going to join him. He's pursuing a business opportunity." "Ah," said all the ladies brightly. They all knew what that meant. Kit did too. It meant that Mr. Howard had gone to Chicago to look for a job. Everyone knew that Mr. Howard hadn't had a job for 2 years, ever since the company he worked for here in Cincinnati had gone out of business. "Where will you live in Chicago?" a lady asked. "I'm not sure yet," said Mrs. Howard, blinking again. "Mr. Howard hasn't settled anywhere. We'll be hither, thither, and yon for a while." The ladies smiled, but Kit saw little lines of concern on their faces. The whole thing sounded pretty fishy to Kit. If the Howards have no place to live in Chicago, why are they leaving their house in Cincinnati? She wondered. Then suddenly it dawned on her. The Howards couldn't stay in their house. They didn't have enough money anymore. And Mr. Howard didn't have a job or a place for them to live in Chicago either. That was the truth. Kit was sure of it. She was pretty sure that all the ladies knew it too, but no one would say it out loud. There was an awkward silence. Then Mother spoke up and made everything better. "I have a marvelous idea, Louise," she said to Mrs. Howard. "We'd love it if you and dear Sterling would stay in our guest room until your husband is settled in Chicago and sends for you. Sterling is about Kit's age. I'm sure they'll get along beautifully." Ruthie nudged Kit, but Kit held her finger to her lips to signal Ruthie not to say anything. The ladies turned toward Mrs. Howard, waiting anxiously for her answer to Mother's invitation. "Well," said Mrs. Howard slowly, "if you're sure it isn't too much trouble, Sterling and I would love to stay. Thank you, Margaret." "That's all settled then," said Mother calmly. All the ladies brightened up, as if a cloud had blown away. Kit started scribbling notes on her notepad, and Ruthie whispered to her, "Who's this boy Sterling?" Kit shrugged. "He's Mrs. Howard's son, I guess," she said. "I haven't met him." "You will," said Ruthie. "He's going to be living in your house." "Looks like it," said Kit. She liked the idea. Boys were always up to something. Sterling was sure to be a good source of stories for her newspaper for Dad. And it would be nice to have a boy around, especially after Charlie left for college. She and Sterling could play catch together. They could talk about the Cincinnati Reds baseball team, which Kit loved, and Ruthie, quite frankly, didn't care about. And Sterling could join in when she and Ruthie acted out stories from the books they read. Kit grinned at Ruthie. "When we play Robin Hood, Sterling can be the sheriff of Nottingham," she said. "Boys like to be the bad guy." Ruthie had a big bite of cake in her mouth. She swallowed, then grinned back at Kit. "Well," she said, "you never know. Sterling might rather be Prince Charming and perform good deeds." "He's already done one good deed," said Kit. "What?" asked Ruthie. "Come on," said Kit. "I'll show you." The two girls slipped back inside the house and ran up the stairs to Kit's room. Kit stood in front of the typewriter. "Sterling's given us a headline," she said to Ruthie. "Look." Kit typed in capital letters, "The Howards are coming." Chapter 2. Read all about it. Kit's real name was Margaret Mildred Kittredge. She was named after her mother and an aunt of her dad's. But when she was very little, her dad used to sing her a song that went like this. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, boys, smile. It was a song he'd learned when he was a soldier fighting in the Great War. Kit loved it. She'd beg Dad, "Sing my song! Sing the Kit song!" Pretty soon, everyone began to call her Kit, which was also short for Kittredge, and the name stuck. Kit didn't like the name Margaret Mildred anyway. It didn't fit her. It was too flouncy. Kit was not a flouncy girl. Right now, she was feeling especially exasperated with flounces because the stool she was sitting on was covered with them. Ruthie and the garden club ladies had left, and Kit was finishing her newspaper for Dad. She had to sit with one leg bent under her to reach the typewriter because the new flouncy stool was as soft as a marshmallow and too low. Kit rolled her newspaper out of the typewriter and read it. She was very pleased with her headline. The Howards are coming. That ought to get Dad's attention. Under the headline, Kit had written, Mrs. Howard is in Mother's Garden Club. Mrs. Howard and her son Sterling are going to be staying with the Kittredge family for a while. Mr. Howard is in Chicago. Having the Howards here will be fun because Sterling can play catch with Kit Kittredge, the best 9-year-old catcher in Cincinnati. Garden club trouble. Phlox spots Mrs. Wilmore beside herself. Kit was struggling with her drawing of 2 Mrs. Wilmores when she heard the car horn's cheery honk honk that signaled her favorite moment of the day. Dad was home from work. Kit snatched up her newspaper, flew downstairs, and burst out the door. Extra, extra, read all about it, she shouted, waving her newspaper as Dad climbed out of his car. Dad caught Kit up in his arms. How's my girl? He asked. Great, said Kit, when her feet were back on the ground. Look, I've got a newspaper for you today. Oh, ho, said Dad. His blue eyes were twinkly. He smiled a broad smile as he took Kit's newspaper and handed her the real one. He read Kit's headline in a booming voice. The Howards are coming. Then he glanced at Kit and spoke in his normal voice. Are they coming for dinner? Nope, said Kit. It's better than that. Read the whole story. Kit watched as Dad's eyes scanned the story. She noticed, much to her surprise, that his smile faded as he read. When Dad spoke, his voice sounded funny, as if he was trying too hard to be hearty. Well, he said, this is big news. He gave Kit's hair a gentle tug. I'm a lucky guy to have my own personal reporter to keep me on top of all the late-breaking stories, he said. Come on, sweetheart. Let's go get the details from your mother. Grown-ups are funny, Kit thought, as she walked along next to Dad. They don't react the way you expect them to. Anyone would think that Dad was not pleased to have the Howards coming to stay. But why on earth wouldn't he be? 2 days later, Kit and Ruthie were sitting on the front steps waiting for Sterling and Mrs. Howard to arrive. The girls were reading while they waited. At least, Ruthie was reading. Kit was too distracted. She was really just looking at the pictures in her book. Kit's copy of Robin Hood and His Adventures had belonged to Charlie when he was her age. It had wonderful illustrations, which Kit loved to study. She especially loved reading about the tree houses that Robin and his men lived in. The houses were connected by swinging bridges and catwalks made out of vines. Kit longed to sleep in a treehouse high up near the sky, surrounded by leaves. She imagined that at night, stars peeked through the leaves and the wind made the branches sway. Kit had spent many hours drawing plans for a treehouse that she and Ruthie could build. Kit was not very good at sketching. Her drawings always looked like dog houses stuck up in trees. They didn't look anything like the tree houses in Sherwood Forest. "I bet," said Kit, "that Sterling can help us build a tree house." Said Ruthie, with the tiniest hint of irritation at being interrupted when she was deep into the story of Beauty and the Beast. It was hot, and the girls were licking chunks of ice that had been chipped off the big block of ice in the icebox. Kit had her catcher's mitt next to her, too. She wanted Sterling to see right away that she was interested in books and baseball, and was not the type of girl who only cared about things like dusting and baking and dresses. Kit's ice chunk had melted to a sliver when, at last, a cab pulled up to the end of the driveway. Kit and Ruthie stood up and waited politely on the front steps. The cab door opened, and Mrs. Howard and a boy got out. When she saw Sterling, Kit felt as if someone had dropped her ice chip down her back. She was so surprised. Ruthie softly, "I thought your mother said that Sterling was about our age," she whispered. "He looks like he's in kindergarten." Sterling stood next to the cab on two of the skinniest legs Kit had ever seen. He was short and pale and skinny all over. His head looked too big for his scrawny neck. The screen door opened and Mother came out of the house. She stood between Kit and Ruthie and put her hands on their shoulders. "Mother," whispered Kit indignantly, "Sterling's a shrimp." "Now, Kit," said Mother, "Sterling is small for his age because his health is delicate. But I'm sure he's a very pleasant fellow." Gently, she pushed the girls forward. "Come along, ladies," she said. "Let's go greet our guests and make them feel welcome." Kit and Ruthie and Mother walked down the steps and toward the driveway. Mrs. Howard and the cab driver were unloading boxes and suitcases from the cab. Sterling just stood there. "Oh," said Mrs. Howard, all aflutter, "Margaret, you are such a dear to have us." She turned to Sterling. "Shake hands with Mrs. Kittredge, Lammy," she said, "and say hello to Kit and Ruthie." Sterling shook Mother's hand and nodded at the girls. He looked even worse close up. He had colorless hair, colorless eyes, and a red, runny nose. Kit towered over him, and Ruthie could have made two of him. He was so puny. "Oh, dear," fussed Mrs. Howard. "All this excitement is not good for Sterling. The poor lamb. He'll have to lie down right away and rest." "Of course," said Mother. "Come with me and we'll get him settled." Kit and Ruthie stood on the driveway and watched as Mrs. Howard and Mother propelled Sterling into the house. The cab driver followed them, carrying an armload of suitcases and boxes. As soon as they were gone, Kit turned to Ruthie and imitated Sterling. She snuffled her nose and made her eyes wide and unblinking. Ruthie giggled, and then she said, "Of course, in fairy tales, you always learn not to judge by appearances. Lots of times, perfectly nice people are under a spell. Think of Beauty and the Beast." But over the next few days, it was clear to Kit that Ruthie's Beauty and the Beast theory didn't work in real life. At least not in Sterling's case. He never said a word. But then he didn't have to. His mother did all the talking, and most of her sentences began with the words, "Sterling can't." When Kit and Ruthie invited Sterling to run through the sprinkler with them, Mrs. Howard said, "Sterling can't be in the sun because his skin is so fair, and Sterling can't run because he has weak lungs. Sterling can't get wet because he might catch a chill, and Sterling can't play in the yard because he's allergic to bee stings." Kit abandoned any idea of Sterling helping with a treehouse or playing catch. Pretty soon, Kit and Ruthie gave up on inviting Sterling to do anything, because the answer was always, "Sterling can't." At first, Kit thought Mrs. Howard was making the whole thing up about how fragile Sterling was. It wasn't as if he had a sickness like rickets or scurvy or any of the really interesting diseases Kit knew about from reading pirate stories. Sterling didn't even have any spots or rashes. However, after he'd been there a week, Sterling got truly sick. Though it was only a cold, he did have a fever and a terrible cough. Mrs. Howard said that he had to stay in bed and have all his meals brought to him on a tray. Kit could hear Sterling coughing and sniffling and blowing his nose all day long. Everyone had to tiptoe past the door to his room so they wouldn't disturb him in case he was napping. Kit held her nose when she passed by because the hall outside his room smelled strongly of Vicks VapoRub, even though the door was always shut. But afternoon, Kit noticed that the door to the guest room was open. She sneaked a peek inside. Sterling was propped up on the pillows, and Mrs. Howard was nowhere to be seen. Of course, it was hard to see anything in the room. It was dark because the shades were pulled down. Kit stood in the doorway and looked at Sterling's moon-white face on the pillow. "Gosh, it sure is stuffy in here," Kit said to Sterling. "Don't you want me to open the window or something?" Sterling nodded. Kit opened the window a crack so that a breath of air and a thin line of sunlight came through. "That's better," she said. Kit turned to go. She was halfway to the door when she saw a photograph next to Sterling's bed that stopped her in her tracks. "Hey," she said. "Is that Ernie Lombardi, the catcher for the Reds?" Sterling's round eyes were as unblinking as an owl's as he looked at Kit. His nose was stuffed up, so his voice sounded weirdly low and husky. "Schnoz," he croaked. For a second, Kit didn't understand. Then she laughed and nodded. "Schnoz," she said. "That's Ernie Lombardi's nickname because he has such a big nose." In answer, Sterling blew his nose, which made a nice honking sound. Kit laughed again. "Ernie Lombardi is my favorite player on the Cincinnati Reds," she said. "He's the reason I'm a catcher. Well, and because my dad was a star catcher on his college team. Did you know that Ernie's the biggest guy on the Reds?" 6'3", whispered Sterling hoarsely. 230 pounds. "Right," said Kit, delighted. She rattled on. "It's funny that you like him," she said, "because he's so big and you're so little." "That's why," said Sterling simply. He didn't sound the least bit offended, even though right after she spoke, Kit realized that she'd said something she shouldn't have. "You know what?" said Kit, suddenly inspired. "I have a newspaper article about Ernie Lombardi. It has a photograph of him holding 7 baseballs in one hand at the same time. It used to be tacked up on my wall. My mother wouldn't let me put it back up after my room was painted pink, but I bet I can find it. Want to see it?" Sterling nodded vigorously, and Kit noticed that his eyes weren't colorless at all. They were gray. "Okay," she said. "I'll get the article and you can read all about it." Kit tore back to her room and rummaged through the drawers of her desk. Where was that newspaper article with the photo of Schnoz? She hoped Mother hadn't thrown it away. Scrambling wildly through the bottom drawer, Kit found the scrap of newspaper at last. She raced back to Sterling's room, shouting, "I found it!" Kit flung open the door and bam! The door hit Mrs. Howard, who was standing right inside with a silver tray in her hands. "My land!" shrieked Mrs. Howard. She lurched forward, and the tray, which had one of Mother's best china teacups and saucers on it, went flying. The hot tea sloshed out all over the rug. The cup hit the floor and shattered, and the tray clanged to the ground with a noise like cymbals. "Oh dear," fussed Mrs. Howard. At the same time, Sterling started to cough loudly. Kit tried to apologize in a voice louder than his coughs, and Charlie appeared and added to the commotion by asking, "What happened? What's all the noise?" They were all talking at once when Mother came in. "Good gracious," she said, above all the racket. "Now what?" Everyone stopped talking, even Mrs. Howard. "Will someone please tell me what's going on?" asked Mother, not sounding at all like her usual serene self. Everyone looked at Kit. Kit knew that Mother disliked messes, so she tried to explain how this one was just an accident. "I'm in here to show Sterling my picture of Ernie Lombardi," she said. "And I didn't know that Mrs. Howard was right behind the door. I was in a hurry, and I—" Mother held up her hand to stop Kit. "Don't tell me," she said. "I can imagine the rest." She shook her head. "How many times have I told you to slow down and watch where you're going, Kit?" "I'm sorry," said Kit. Mother stooped down to pick up the broken cup. "Just look at what you've done," she said. Kit was shocked. It wasn't like Mother to scold her like this. "But it wasn't my fault," she protested. "It was an accident. It was nobody's fault." "Nobody's fault," repeated Mother. "And yet look at the mess we're in." She looked up at Kit. "Please, go now. she said. "I'll help Mrs. Howard clean up. And Kit, dear, please don't barge in here bothering Sterling and making messes anymore." "But I didn't," Kit began. "That's enough, Kit," said Mother. "Go now." Kit gave up. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her room. Mother seemed to think that the mess was all her fault. But it wasn't. She didn't mean to knock into Mrs. Howard. Stupid old Sterling was more to blame for the mess than Kit was. If he weren't sick, his mother wouldn't have been bringing him hot tea in the middle of the afternoon in the first place. Kit flung herself down at the desk and looked at the wrinkled newspaper article in her hand. What did it matter that her photo of Ernie Lombardi holding 7 baseballs was all crumpled up? She couldn't put it up on her new pink walls, and she sure wasn't going to show it to Sterling. She wasn't going to try to be nice to old sniffle-nosed Sterling ever again. Look at the trouble it caused her. Nothing made Kit more angry than being unjustly accused. She didn't mind a good fair fight, but to be blamed for something that was not her fault? That she could not stand. In books, when people were accused of crimes they didn't commit, someone like Nancy Drew or Dick Tracy always came around and proved that they were innocent. Kit could see that in her case, she was going to have to speak for herself. She knew just how to do it, too. She'd write a special newspaper for Dad. Then at least one person would know her side of the story. Kit rolled a piece of paper into the typewriter. In capital letters, she typed her headline. "It's not fair." Chapter 3. It's Not Fair. Pounding the typewriter keys as hard as she could made Kit feel better. The good thing about writing was that she got to tell the whole story without anyone interrupting or contradicting her. Kit was pleased with her article when it was finished. It explained exactly what had happened and how the teacup was broken. Then, at the end, it said, "Sometimes a person is trying to do something nice for another person, and it turns out sadly, badly by mistake. When something bad happens, and it isn't anyone's fault, no one should be blamed. It's not fair." Kit pulled her article out of the typewriter and marched outside to sit on the steps and wait for Dad to come home. She brought her book about Robin Hood to read while she waited. She had not been reading long before the screen door squeaked open and slammed shut behind her. Kit didn't even lift her eyes off the page. Charlie sat next to her. "Hi," he said. Kit didn't answer. She was a little put out with Charlie for adding to the trouble in Sterling's room. "What's eating you, Squirt?" Charlie asked. "Nothing," said Kit, as helpfully as... Charlie looked at the piece of paper next to Kit. "Is that one of your newspapers for Dad?" he asked. "Yup," said Kit. Charlie picked up Kit's newspaper and looked at that. "It's not fair," he read aloud. Then he asked, "What's this all about?" "It's about how it's wrong to blame people for things that are not their fault," said Kit. "For example, me, for the mess this afternoon." "Aw, come on, Kit," said Charlie. "That's nothing. You shouldn't make such a big deal of it." "That's easy for you to say," she said. Charlie took a deep breath in and then let it out. "Listen, Kit," he said. in a voice that was suddenly serious. "I wouldn't bother Dad with this newspaper today if I were you." Kit slammed her book shut and looked sideways at Charlie. "And why not?" she asked. Charlie glanced over his shoulder to be sure that no one except Kit would hear him. "You know how lots of people have lost their jobs because of the Depression, don't you?" he asked. "Sure," said Kit. "Like Mr. Howard." "Well," said Charlie, "yesterday, Dad told Mother and me that he's closing down his car dealership and going out of business." "What?" said Kit. She was horrified. "But," she sputtered, "but why?" "Why do you think?" said Charlie. "Because nobody has money to buy a car anymore. They haven't for a long time now." "Well, how come Dad didn't say anything before this?" Kit asked. "He didn't want us to worry," said Charlie. "And he kept hoping things would get better if he just hung on. He didn't even fire any of his salesmen. He used his own savings to keep paying their salaries." "What's Dad going to do now?" asked Kit. "I don't know," said Charlie. "He even has to give back his own car. He can't afford it anymore. I guess he'll look for another job, though that's pretty hopeless these days." Kit was sure that Charlie was wrong. "Anyone can see that Dad's smart and hard-working," she said. "And he has so many friends. People still remember him from when he was a baseball star in college. Plenty of people will be glad to hire him." Charlie shrugged. "There just aren't any jobs to be had. Why do you think people are going away?" "Dad's not going to leave like Mr. Howard did," said Kit, struck by that terrible thought. Then she was struck by another terrible thought. "We're not going to lose our house like the Howards, are we?" "I don't know," said Charlie again. Kit could hardly breathe. "It'll be a struggle to keep it," said Charlie. "Dad told me that he and Mother don't own the house completely. They borrowed money from the bank to buy it, and they have to pay the bank back a little every month. It's called a mortgage. If they don't have enough money to pay the mortgage, the bank can take the house back." "Well, the people at the bank won't just kick us out onto the street, will they?" asked Kit. "Yes," said Charlie. "That's exactly what they'll do. You've seen those pictures in the newspapers of whole families and all their belongings out on the street with nowhere to go." "That is not going to happen to us," said Kit fiercely. "It's not." "I hope not," said Charlie. "Listen," said Kit. "How come Dad told Mother and you about losing his job, but not me?" Charlie sighed a huge, sad sigh. "Dad told me," he said slowly, "because it means that I won't be able to go to college." "Oh, Charlie!" wailed Kit, full of sympathy and misery. She knew that Charlie had been looking forward to college so much, and now he couldn't go. "That's terrible! That's awful! It's not fair!" Charlie grinned a cheerless grin and tapped one finger on Kit's newspaper. "That's your headline, isn't it?" he said. "These days, a lot of things happen that aren't fair. There's no one to blame, and there's nothing that can be done about it." Charlie's voice sounded tired, as if he'd grown old all of a sudden. "You better get used to it, Kit,"